Hi, everyone. Welcome to hardwear.io webinar. Today, we are also streaming on YouTube in addition to our Zoom webinar. And please welcome our speaker for today, Brad Ree. Brad will present the current landscape of global IoT security regulations, and he will talk about the continued fragmentation and surprising approaches taken by some countries. And Brad is the CTO of ioXt. In this role, he leads the ioXt security products supporting the ioXt Alliance. And he is highly versed in many IoT protocols and their associated security models. The presentation will take around 20-30 minutes, and we will have questions at the end. So please feel free to send Brad any questions in the chat, and he will answer them after his presentation. So Brad, now stage is yours. You can start your presentation.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Here we go. So I'd like to sort of start out the ioXt Alliance. We're basically the global standard for IoT security, but what we really are is over 200 device manufacturers, retailers, basically ecosystems, network operators, and service providers, all really working to address consumer security concerns. What we really did was we developed a IoT security standard based a lot on what we were seeing happening out in the global regulatory markets, but then also what our board companies and such are using in their own ecosystems. And the core thing that we did was we developed a testable and scalable security standard that really applies from light bulbs to set-top boxes to cars and cell phones. Now, the reason for all of that is really sort of to talk about what's happening in the regulatory space, and you'll see sort of why industry went in this direction. But let's start out with a little bit of back to the future and where this all began. So, the real shot that went across all the bows of the government were the Mirai botnet attack back in 2016. So, a couple of interesting facts is sort of looking back through this, right? Quite a bit of stuff was really written on this. But the interesting thing about this attack was really it ended up being only about 23 different manufacturers. So, it just happened that those 23 manufacturers had a whole lot of volume and could really go and drive a lot of chaos out there. The interesting thing about that, though, is prior to their attack, what they were trying to do was they wanted to hide their activities. So they actually released the source code into GitHub, and then soon after went and launched the attack. What's also sort of interesting, just literally last night, I did another search on GitHub. Now, keep in mind, this isn't a terribly scientific approach, but there's now 850 repositories that contain some form of Mirai. And even the rate of growth really surprised me. I had recently looked at this back in November, and there was only about 600. So people are still using this framework, replicating it, and expanding. So this is really the seminal activity that woke up a lot of governments and said, we should really start doing something about IoT security. Yeah, here we go. So just back it up a little bit, right? So, the Mirai attack, for those who weren't aware, was really, it's a Japanese given name for the future and everything. So means a little bit more now that I got my screen shared. Thank you so much. So this here is what we really see happening in the US for regulations. And what I want to really focus on was the fragmentation here. If you take a look, you got states going to the left and the federal government going to the right. Everyone's trying to do their own things. But as a result of the Mirai attack, California was one of the first states to actually go and get a law on the books. Now, the California bill was sort of interesting. On its surface, it tried to do a pretty decent thing. It just said no pre-programmed passwords. So, or at least if there is a pre-programmed password on the first login, you have to change. So that would actually make it, pretty straightforward. However, where they started getting into more interesting troubled waters is they added the clause reasonable security. So, the challenge with reasonable security, of course, is what is reasonable. And at this time, when this went through, there were no federal guidelines, nothing from NIST, nothing really too terribly published. There were a couple federal trade commission actions that were taken against some people that people were looking at. But this is, for anyone here in the United States, State Bill 327 is sort of the big call to action, as we got to be a little bit more careful and help try to define these reasonable security things. Now, what's interesting for those who may be in other countries, the United States has this regional, state versus the federal kind of thing. What's interesting with the states is once one state does something, well, then another state tends to pick it on up. Oregon, being right next to California, just sort of looked to the south and said, hey, that looks like an interesting thing. But then they went and expanded it. So what we really see is, this example of they follow through with the same, pre-programmed passwords, added, the same reasonable security issue, but then they even went a little bit further and talked about, generation of new means, and then sort of a half step backwards, where unlike California, where, this law is going to be impacting California, Oregon said, this law is here unless there's a federal regulation. Now, another couple of interesting things that came out of Oregon versus California was Oregon went and started defining a little bit more the type of devices. So you see down here in A, what they really did was they said, these IoT devices, we're going to target just personal use. So this isn't per se commercial or things like that. The other interesting thing that they did, though, is expanded from just talking about internet protocols to any other address, and included the indirect communications. So these things start pulling in other protocols like Zigbee and Z-Wave and things like that that sit behind the gateway. So the challenge here, though, is with 50 states, each of these states started doing different things. We see continued fragmentation. Just as a little key here, the bullets here with dark lines around them have all been enacted. The dash lines are still being discussed and everything. And we see things like in Virginia now, they're going even further and saying the password should have, so many characters, so many numbers, things like this. From an IoT standpoint, this becomes rather troublesome when if you're trying to, ship a connected light bulb and it's going to Mississippi and it has to have a, 15 character password versus going to Minnesota and it has to have 15 plus special characters. So these are the kind of things that really have us concerned. Now, on the flip side, Congress finally started taking a look at this. But for those who follow politics in the United States here, we've got a very fragmented, very politicized environment. So sure enough, Congress couldn't just settle on one idea. They launched two different potential bills. Now, neither of these bills have been enacted yet. They've gone through committee more on the IoT Improvement Act, which really is just sort of a half step forward. This act was really meant to say, anything that the government purchases must meet these security requirements. But in the United States, this gets to be a bit of a slippery slope when you look at how much stimulus money goes into things like solar panels and things like that, and exactly where this would be applied. Now, what we also see with a lot of these early regulations, and as they've moved, so in the early regulations, as I mentioned, things like Virginia saying how many characters in a password, the original IoT Improvement Act had a very similar thing. They explicitly call out in the bill what kind of security features had to be there. Now, the real challenge there is, think about it, if we barely can get anything through Congress, do you want to have to go get a bill passed to change the length of a password? So instead, what has really happened is the latest version of the IoT Improvement Act basically said, security guidelines should be followed from NIST. So Thus, we've seen the latest movement here, NIST IR 8259, which I'll get into in a second. They went and they tried to define what security should look like for consumer and commercial products. The interesting thing with NIST is not a regulatory body. They're just a standards organization. Typically, their stuff is written as best practices and such. So even looping back to sort of my opening statement about the ioXt Alliance and that testability, this is one of the things that we actually see as a challenge coming out of this approach is when you write a best practice, it's not necessarily a testable standard. But let's take a look at the NIST stuff. So on its surface, NIST really settled into 6 core items: device identification, protection of the data, software updates, configuration, protection of the interfaces, and then a cyber state awareness. Now, what's interesting is if you look at what's happening on the NIST side versus the European side, when we get over to the European side, you'll see that these two don't necessarily line up, which does cause some issues for anyone shipping globally and everything. But the other thing that I'd like to sort of point out, so the NIST IR 8259 was published just last week. There's a couple of these items in here that are concerning, and I definitely would recommend folks taking a look at. Things like that device identification. So clearly pinning device identity when a product enters a network, right? You have to build a root of trust and all this. That's important. But on the flip side, should every single consumer product have a unique logical identifier? So these are some of the kind of concerns from a data privacy, even thinking, looking at GDPR and some of these other things. If every single device has these unique identifiers, and if they become immutable, what does that mean in the long term? Another couple of things that are sort of surprising in this, in the 8259, is requirements here that the cryptographic keys can actually be adjusted by authorized entities. So, that, and along with the ability to do software rollback, those two things would be concerning for most folks running large ecosystems and everything, right? Typically, rollback attacks are definitely, an attack vector. Anyone who can downgrade a key length, that's, we've seen those kind of issues come on up in some of the latest Bluetooth attacks and things like that. So I just want to caution, those who are tracking this to absolutely watch for some of these kind of things and, encourage change where possible. The good news with this is not per se a regulation. These are still just best practices or guidelines. So flipping over to Europe, we see things a little bit cleaner. There seems to be less of the fragmentation between at least, the local countries in the European Union. Essentially, the path that we see happening and the dominant regulation that's come out is the EN 303-645. That really traces its heritage back to the IoT code of practice that the UK government put out through their Department of Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport, or as they like to call themselves, or the Department of Fun. So these guys, right, if you think about why would the sport group be looking at IoT security, well, really it comes down to digital rights management through the media and broadcast protection. So that's the heritage of where that group started. But what they really did was they came up with their 13 core principles. And from these 13 core, this is what went into EN 303-645. These mostly stayed intact. But like any committee work, once things got started, they quickly expanded. I think the last time I looked at this, I think it's about 60 different sub-elements here. At its core, what we see is the 3 primary things: no default password, vulnerability disclosure program, and having devices as upgradable. As a matter of fact, in the UK right now, there's been some announcements that they plan to introduce into Parliament some kind of regulation enforcing these three items. So, like I said, on its surface, this all looks great. Some of the challenges, though, on a global nature is, first and foremost, what you really see between the US approach, or I should say the North American approach and the European approach, is in the European side, there's a little bit more of a consumer focus along with data protection. So things, very much reading on GDPR, where you've got to be able to make it easy to delete personal data, along with ensuring that the data is protected. Like I say, on its surface, that's all good. But then there's some other things as you get into some of the details where companies are going to optionally be asked to disclose what sensors are in their devices, what data is in the telemetry information, things that get to be a little bit more difficult, especially if you've got deep supply chains and everything. Another set of features of this that at least is just some caution here is the scalability of some of these. So, we all know that validating input data is super critical to do, but in practice and in scale, how do we verify all of the IoT devices meet these kind of things? Even things like minimizing attack surface. Once again, that's definitely very good security best practices. But then as you look at it from a testability, how does that happen in practice and in scale? So flip it on over to Japan. Japan last year took a really different approach to the problem. So essentially what they've got is in the build up to the Olympics, they were very concerned about what was happening in the network. They were concerned about a mass botnet attack. And so the approach that they really took was, instead of encouraging change or regulating the devices that went out, they almost took more of a policing approach. So what they did was they gave some of their agencies the permission to scan everyone's network. So anything that was in your home and publicly connected, they would scan against known username and passwords. Then where this gets to be sort of interesting is they would do the scans, they reach out to the internet service providers. Internet service providers would tell the consumers that they have a device in their home that appears to be hackable. And then also there would be support to help people work through this. So this made the news pretty big when it first got announced. What's rather interesting, just sort of looking through where they're at, the first 6 months of this project, I forget the exact number, but it was tens of millions of devices were scanned. And what was rather interesting about this was about 150 notices per day went to the carriers and the ISPs. So it wasn't an insanely large number, but 150 devices per day when there's something like cameras and set-top boxes and DVRs. These kind of things can really sort of pile up and wreak havoc on the network. Now, in practice, what's sort of interesting is this here is, and luckily I believe I removed all the account information. This was a similar thing that AT&T had sent over to my dad a couple years ago. Very similar, AT&T detecting something in the network. But I question, when you send something like this to a consumer, what actions can they take, right? Are they empowered to actually take action here? So, I had gone and visited my dad, and he pulled out this email and said, "Hey, I received this. AT&T says something in my house has been taken over, but what is it?" And my first comment as I read through this is, I said, "Well, Dad, you received this in October," and he goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, it's June. Did you do anything?" And his comment was, "Well, I didn't know what to do, so I just filed it away until I could talk to you in person and see what's going on." So though the policing approach is interesting, the real challenge to any kind of consumer, especially with any amount of equipment in the home, is what exact actions can you take? So pulling back up to at least where the ioXt Alliance really took this. So what we did was we looked at what's happening in those regulatory bodies. We still see some pretty large philosophical shifts between the policing approach of Japan, consumer-centric approach of Europe, and more of the minimalist device-centric approach of Europe, and really try to build a set of standards that sort of weaves between those until we can see some consolidation around there. So the core message here is there's still a lot of work to be done. I'll back up here to the latest area that we see is we do see the current fight for global regulations has actually been moved up to ISO. I think that's where we're probably going to finally see North America and Europe come together. It's still a little bit unclear on what kind of enforcement we're going to see out of that. But I do hold hope that at least in ISO is an international organization that is really at least set up for this. But I still am holding my breath to see exactly where this lands. So with that, I like to open it up for any questions.
Yeah,
I think I'm supposed to look in a chat window, right?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, you can open the chat window and yeah, people can send the questions over there. Let's give them a few moments to type it in.
Sure thing. And as people are thinking and everything, yes, I do question the approach of sending grandparents email address or emails that talk about an IP in your home has been hacked. It's like that email I love to just say because it's one of those wonderful actions. Like, what do you do about that, right? So got a question here on how are startups and large manufacturers digesting different standards, and then what is working for them and what are their concerns with respect to these. So there is a challenge for the startups for sure. At least I'll give the little bit of a pitch once again for what the ioXt Alliance is we do see, unfortunately, the regulatory game is mostly a large corporation game. Obviously the meetings are open, happening all around, but it is a little time consuming to spend time in London and in DC, and especially with all the travel constraints. But anyone can attend these meetings, it just takes some time. What we do see is large manufacturers typically already have their own security standards. So what we see is quite a bit of positioning of making sure that the regulations fix the minimum bar and don't go too terribly far. So from a startup standpoint, that would of course be a very big concern, is if the bar is raised too high, does this add too much time and cost to their products? And then what is working for them and what are their concerns? So the biggest concern that the manufacturers who we talk to is essentially the fragmentation. So if you're building a device and it needs to be sold, globally, just dealing with all the different plug types is a big enough challenge. But if each, especially in the United States, if there are 50 different IoT regulations, that is a real big problem for companies to scale. The other thing that we see is as all the organizations started, we all agreed at the high level, but as we start working down into the details, you start to see some drifts in different directions. So really, as of today, both the North American and European standards are a challenge. They don't align in the same direction. So that would be the biggest concern that I see from everyone. And yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh on this one. Is there a regulation that states, that cryptographic operations should be done using dedicated hardware accelerators, or would a certified software implementation suffice? I'm sorry, where I thought that is even standard-based cryptography is a challenge internationally. You'll see that some of the curves that that were pushed in different countries aren't universally recognized. What we do see though is, yeah, should dedicated hardware accelerators be used? For the most part, everyone's leaning towards that that's where we should go. One of the biggest challenges, and even in the ioXt Alliance, we had this discussion around should secure boot based on hardware root of trust be baseline? And the core problem that we have with this is hardware root of trust processors and dedicated hardware accelerators aren't universally available in all these small Zigbee radios and in the the little tiny sensors that have to run off coin cell batteries for 10 years. So this is where the real balance. I think most people have multiple levels and they're encouraging folks to go to hardware-based accelerators. But when you look at all the things in that IoT, it's a real big swath to go from the set-top box all the way down to the lowly light bulb. And it's the light bulb and these low-end products that are concerning to set that bar there. All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, I definitely appreciate being invited on and able to talk to everyone. If there's any other questions, feel free to reach on out. And, I love to talk about all this fun security issues. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much again for your presentation, Brad. It was really interesting.